Look how the Americans reacted back in '62 when you had the Cuban Missile Crisis. When missiles were put in Cuba, pointing at US cities, the Americans said they must be removed or we will take action. And a compromise was reached. The Americans were not willing to tolerate that. So why should the Russians be expected to tolerate missiles surrounding their country in that situation? So what could easily have been done was simply an announcement that Ukraine won't join NATO, there will be no missiles stationed there, and also that there would be a democratic solution to the problems of the Donbass and Crimea. And the people are Russian. That's who they are. They were Russian up till 1954 when Khrushchev gifted Crimea to the Ukrainian Socialist Republic. Didn't have much meaning then because they were all part of the USSR, but they are all Russian speakers. It's the place where the Russian naval fleet is based, a warm water port, right? And yet Ukraine has been saying we're going to retake Crimea, despite the fact 90% of the people are Russian and don't want that. Donbass, again, Russian speakers. Ukraine has been saying we're going to retake Donbass through military force, and they've been shelling that area since 2014. There's been a civil war going on in Ukraine. We didn't hear much about it since that coup in 2014 sponsored by the Americans, where they said that they'd spent $5 billion in order to get a president that they wanted there, right? And when that happened, one of the first things the government did was that it would not allow Russian to be an official language. That was removed, and there was obvious discrimination against Russian speakers, and the Russian speakers reacted to it, and the civil war started. And part of that civil war, which the fascists, Ukrainian fascists, who have been strong for a number of years, you might know the history of the Ukrainian fascists siding with the Hitler regime, the OUN, the Banderites, to fight with Hitler against the Red Army. And they in the 50s, they were also supported by the USA, and at the end of the war, a lot of the exiles, the fascist exiles, went to live in Canada and in the States and were funded by the CIA to keep organisations running within Ukraine. But fascism is strong in Ukraine, and the people, the Azov regiment you'll have heard of, were involved in the shelling of the people of Donbass, and were involved in the May the 2nd massacre in 2014 in Odessa, where 48 Russian speakers were murdered in the trade union headquarters. They've been organising protests to defend the Russian language and to stop discrimination against Russians and to allow local autonomy, because that's what they were asking for initially in the Donbass, Lugansk region and Crimea, for autonomy. But you had the situation where the fascists mobilised against them. The fascists are anti-Russian. They review Russian people as the enemy, and they are quite a military force. It's said often that electorally they don't get high votes, but they have their own regiment, like the Azov, that's been involved in the fighting in Mariupol. And they also recruit fascists internationally. The point was that the 2014 coup that was sponsored by the Americans was part of turning Ukraine into a US semi-colony. And the US have been training the forces there since then. And there's obviously been a long-term plan to try and provoke action from Russia. And eventually it came in February the 22nd when the Russians took action, partly to defend the people that were under attack in Donbass, because at that time the Ukrainian regime was mobilising its forces to attack these areas and had stated that they were going to retake Crimea by force, and had stated that they were going to join NATO and considering getting nuclear weapons, because Ukraine used to have nuclear weapons before the dissolution of the Soviet Union. So you had a definite attempt to provoke Russia, and Russia, I don't defend the invasion, but I think it's a defensive action. Any idea that Russia's trying to conquer Europe or create a Russian empire, etc., it's ludicrous. Russian economy is a very weak economy. It's mainly based on the export of gas, oil, and an armaments industry, but there's not that much else left. It's got a GDP of something like Italy. The idea that it could somehow sweep through Germany and France, that's just all propaganda. It's a defensive move to protect against the encroachment of NATO and the obvious desire of Biden and the American government to have regime change in Moscow. And so, really, there would be an easy peace solution. And at one point, Zelensky, there was discussions that looked as if that was going to happen. And the Americans stepped in and the British stepped in to rule it out. Now they're talking about what is needed is a Ukrainian victory. A Ukrainian victory would mean, in effect, retaking the Donbass, oppressing the Russian speakers there, retaking Crimea, which would be, since it's part of Russian territory now, would be an existential question for the Russian government, which you would have a real danger of nuclear war. There is no sensible peace being proposed on the NATO side. I mean, it would be easy to propose, well, why not have referendums? There was a referendum in Crimea and the people voted to go to Russia, but why not have one in Donbass where the people can decide, do they want independence, do they want to join Russia, or do they want to be Ukraine? That could be easily done to allow self-determination, but that's not presented in our media, where it's presented as simply a small nation fighting against an oppressor, Russia, who wants to take them over and obliterate them. I think that is just not the reality. The Russians have not got the type of troops that could take over a country the size of Ukraine involved. I mean, 120,000 is what is talked about that they've involved in this. So the reality is the West and NATO are intervening here to stop a peace deal, as are the far right in Ukraine, who have said that if Zelensky makes a deal that recognises autonomy for Donbass or recognises Russian sovereignty over Crimea, he will be hanged by the far right. So I think the importance is in NATO land or in Britain, Britain has been particularly vociferous in supporting Ukraine and sending arms there and training people and getting troops in that area. It's important in Britain and in the rest of the NATO countries that we try and build up a current that says this is an unnecessary and aggressive war. We don't want that. We want a democratic peace, and we want to avert the danger of escalation to nuclear war, because there's no doubt about it, that is a real danger. If they're talking about building up military force to take back Crimea, there's every possibility the Russians would respond with nuclear weapons in that situation. I mean, only a few days ago, Biden has given $40 billion to the defence of Ukraine for armaments. All the latest armaments are trying to be funneled in there. And obviously, if the Russians feel themselves that they're getting overwhelmed, the danger is nuclear weapons might be used. And that's why it's really centrally important that we try and build up a movement that confronts that. Unfortunately, there's no one in the establishment or even in political life that's prominent that's taken an anti-war position, unlike 2003. And there has to be people in the West, people in NATO land that say, we don't want this war. We want peace with the Russian people. We don't see any need for all this death and destruction and all this expenditure in arms, rather than expenditure on improving people's lives. So that's why we want to try and get an open committee in this city, linked up in other cities, to try and build a current that says no to war.